How's everybody doing today? This is Dr. Buffano. This is my lecture series on Middle East politics. This is going to be lecture 28. We're going to talk about the war on terrorism, as well as the failures of that particular war. So let's get to it. Let me just share my screen with all of you. By the way, don't forget to like and subscribe if you like this video. So for today's lecture, we're going to continue our discussion on political Islam within the Middle East. And we're going to shine a spotlight specifically on the war on terrorism. Now, last lecture, we talked a lot about Salafist jihadist organizations and terrorist tactics. Now, for today's lecture, we're going to discuss the different ways states can respond to the challenge of terrorism and the strengths and weaknesses of those strategies. And we're going to also specifically look at how the George W. Bush administration responded to 9/11. We're going to look at the war on terrorism, what it was, why it emerged, and the failures of that response. So we're going to talk a lot about that. And we're going to talk specifically on how the America's war on terrorism impacted the state of Iraq. So that's going to be our case study for today. So to get started on this, I want to talk a little bit about 9/11. Now, I lived through 9/11 personally. I remember I was going to Newfield High School in Long Island. I was sitting in my economics class senior year, and a teacher from another classroom knocked on the door and told us that one of the Twin Towers had been hit by an airplane. And then a little bit later, we learned about a second aircraft hitting the other tower. And of course, both of those towers ended up collapsing. The Pentagon also got hit with an aircraft. Another plane crashed in Pennsylvania. There were four planes that were hijacked in total by members of a Salafist jihadist organization in Al Qaeda. 16 hijackers, armed only with box cutters, took control of four aircraft midair, and they crashed those planes into the Twin Towers. And of course, Al Qaeda, their motive for this was several. Number one, U.S. past support for the Israeli states. Number two, the United States military bases that were located within the Arab Gulf, as well as, just this long history of Western influence on the Middle East, right? The spread of Western values into the Middle East, the long history of colonialism. And finally, Al Qaeda was seeking to push back against secular and liberal influences within the region. They were seeking to spread their own Salafist Islamist ideology into different parts of the world. Now, of course, the targets. So, why did Al Qaeda target these particular sites? Well, number one, the Pentagon, of course, this is the center of the U.S. military, right? So they were attacking a American political target. But the Twin Towers as well, the target here in New York City, New York was the economic capital of the United States, and in many ways, the economic capital of the globe, right? It's the center of global capitalism, the center of American economic power. And so by attacking this site, Al Qaeda was also attacking these various political, economic, and cultural centers of Western influence. Now, of course, what Al Qaeda was hoping to do with this act of terrorism, right, is to spread fear within the United States and the rest of the globe, to galvanize both the West and the Middle East. They were hoping that this would lead to the spread of Islamophobia within the United States and an aggressive response by America towards the Islamic world. And this in turn would then lead to anti-Western sentiments within the Middle East and the spread of political Islam. So that was the point of these attacks, right? So it was part of a longer string of attacks made by Al Qaeda on Western as well as secular Muslim targets in the preceding decade throughout the 1990s. So we talked about that a lot last lecture. So in response to this, the U.S. as well as many other governments throughout the Middle East and the West had to figure out how are we going to deal with this growing problem with terrorism? What are the different ways to respond to this issue, right? So you're beginning to see the growth of groups during this era, such as Al Qaeda, later ISIS, engaging in these attacks on civilians using violence. Well, there are two different ways to deal with it. Well, number one, obviously, you can use coercion, you can use force to destroy it. This might involve, for example, tactics such as invading other countries where terrorist groups operate. It might involve spying on the internet activity of these various groups. It might involve bombing other countries. It might involve trying to arrest suspected activists and using torture on them, imprisoning these folks. So that's coercion. So that's one tactic. Now, of course, there are downsides to using these tactics, right? Number one, it doesn't address many of the grievances of these groups. Well, certainly many of the grievances of groups like Al Qaeda might be something you can't compromise with. There are other grievances in which you can, right? So using force alone doesn't deal with the various factors that make terrorism more likely. We learned last class that terrorism becomes more likely in unstable, poor states that are authoritarian. And if you don't address those various issues, well, you're not going to be addressing the factors that make terrorism more likely. So there's a weakness to using pure force alone to addressing terrorism. Now, the other tactic to addressing terrorism is to use what is called co-optation, right? So this is when instead of using force, so you have a problem with terrorism in another country, you could have the international community invest in economic development. You could promote democratization so that this leads to less radicalization of individuals. And yes, this might involve the West changing strategies, less military bases within the region, stop giving foreign aid to autocrats. So this strategy, right, it tries to deal with the long-term factors that make terrorism more likely. So promoting democratization, promoting economic development. Now, of course, this strategy also has its downsides. A, it's expensive to invest in economic development in other countries. Number two, sometimes there are things that you can't, compromise on here with some of these organizations. After all, groups like the Taliban and Al Qaeda try to suppress women's rights. They are some of these groups are opposed to democratization, right? So sometimes you can't compromise with these groups on certain issues. So there are downsides here to co-optation. So there are weaknesses to each of these strategies. And as we're going to find out, the United States after 9/11, they chose the coercion strategy. And this strategy is going to have a lot of failures because it's not going to address any of the grievances of the people of this region. And on top of that, it's not going to really end the problem with terrorism. In many ways, it's going to make it worse. If you try to use force to suppress terrorism, it could lead to more terrorism, right? So if I try to drop bombs on a country to stop terrorism, I end up killing a lot of innocent civilians. This can make terrorism worse. All right, so the war on terrorism, what was it? After 9/11, the United States and the George W. Bush administration, it was a Republican administration that consisted of neoconservatives, they went with the coercion response. So domestically after 9/11, the George Bush administration decided to go with trying to increase the security states, right? So in 2001, right after 9/11, the Patriot Act was passed. This empowered the NSA to monitor online activity. So this organization, one of its main responsibilities is to monitor electronic activity. So they tried to crack down on groups like Al Qaeda by spying on people's internet activity. It made it easier for the governments to basically spy on what people were doing. And on top of that as well, they empowered institutions like the TSA at airports to engage in airport security. This made it more difficult to travel, right? So that's why when you go to the airport today, you got to take off your shoes, you got to walk through metal detectors. So at home, they began to, at various points in time, crack down on civil liberties at the with the justification that this would lead to a crackdown on terrorism. So with those TSA reforms, they were hoping that hijackers could never use planes again as a weapon. With the NSA reforms, they were hoping that they could spy on terrorists. But at the same time, this means they're also spying on innocent civilians at the same time. And this allowed the NSA to collect a lot of data on innocent civilians in the process. Now, after 9/11 as well, the Department of Homeland Security was created. This new department within the US government would basically help many security agencies within the United States, the CIA, the FBI, the NSA, to coordinate, of course, groups. And on top of this as well, they started coordinating with organizations like the IRS. So they tried to crack down, for example, on money laundering. They tried to make it more difficult for terrorist groups to get access to funding. So the Homeland Security Organization was this big umbrella organization. One of the failures of 9/11 was that different organizations within the US government had little bits and pieces of information on Al Qaeda, but they didn't have it all coordinated. And if they were able to coordinate that information before 9/11, they could have stopped 9/11 from happening in the first place. So we get the Department of Homeland Security created. And of course, this was very controversial. On the one hand, it was justified to crack down on terrorism. On the other hand, it significantly increased the power of the American government to spy on American citizens and to basically invest in security at home at the expense of civil liberties. Now, the other part of the response here was with the foreign response. The US government began to give foreign aid to countries all across the Islamic world to crack down on terrorism. They began to give funding to governments and counterterrorism training. They began to give a lot of funding to militaries to try to bring more stability to those countries. In fact, there were 58 countries across the Islamic world that were given aid by the US government. The US as well began to increase its military presence in the region, increase the number of bases. And so we get 44 US military bases being used for training across the Islamic world. So this was part of the war on terror after 9/11. And on top of that, with the cooperation of these governments in the Islamic world, governments like, for example, Egypt, governments like Tunisia, governments like Algeria and Mali and Niger, and the list goes on and on. So the US began to cooperate with those governments to crack down on terrorism. And they also began to use those bases for interrogations and torture in order to elicit information from suspected terrorists and to engage in further crackdown. So Al Qaeda, as we learned last lecture, and other Salafist jihadist organizations had a lot of these underground cells in many countries throughout the globe. So the idea was to find these cells and crack down on them using interrogation and using torture. And so one of these military bases that was used for this purpose was Guantanamo Bay, which is located on the coast of Cuba. So Guantanamo Bay was used as a site of interrogation and torture. Now, on top of that as well, you had a lot of these jihadist organizations prior to 9/11 that they were operating in a lot of war zones, and as well as in places that had very weak states, in places like Yemen, Somalia, Sudan, Pakistan, and so on and so forth. So the idea was you could target those groups using drone strikes. So the United States began to use its Air Force to start dropping bombs on places where it was suspected where Salafi jihadists were located. In fact, the war on terror involved the bombing of the following countries: Libya, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Somalia, and Yemen. Okay, these countries were historically very unstable, either prior to the War on Terror or after the Arab Spring in 2011. And so the United States begins to drop a lot of bombs down. In the process, many innocent civilians get killed. So this is another controversial aspect of the War on Terror. And finally, the United States engaged in the full-scale invasions of various countries. First, of course, it was Afghanistan. Now, why Afghanistan? This was the home base of Al Qaeda. It's where Al Qaeda formed. We talked about this last lecture. And so the United States invades, and this invasion had a lot of global support, particularly from the UN, because A, Al Qaeda was from there, and B, the Taliban refused to hand them over. And so, as a consequence, the US invades and ends up occupying this country for about 2 decades. And on top of that, as well, a year later, we're going to talk about the reasons why this was the case. The US is going to invade Iraq, and they're going to occupy this country for about 8 years until 2011, and then again in 2014 for reasons we'll talk about later. And finally, there's also going to be, some troops that are going to enter Syria in parts of Syria in 2014. We're not going to overthrow the government there ourselves, but we're going to occupy parts of this country. So we've got, just to kind of sum it up, we've got seven countries that were bombed. We've got 3 countries that were invaded. We've got 58 countries across the Islamic world that were given foreign aid and counterterrorism training, 44 new U.S. military bases used for interrogation. We've got the Homeland Security created, Department of Homeland Security, and the Patriot Act passed. So for a problem that as of 2016 was only killing about 25,000 people across the entire world, this was a bit of a response here, right? This was a bit of an extreme response using coercion to the War on Terror. And this map just kind of says it all here. This is showing the various spots where new U.S. military bases were established, where combat troops were sent, where training and counterterrorism took place, where invasions took place. So this was an extensive operation. It actually involved 39% of the world's countries in total. And so very extensive operation across the region. And in the process, after 9/11, there was a lot of Islamophobia in the United States. And we begin to see as well the use of a lot of force to deal with terrorism. And it was expensive. From 2001 until 2015, the war on terror cost the United States $1.7 trillion. Now, here's the thing with 9/11. It was horrible. And I remember I grew up, it's when I was growing up, I lived through the experience. So I was only 17 years old at the time. And, it was tough seeing over 3,000 of my fellow citizens killed. It was traumatic for the country seeing that on television. But at the same time, terrorism, the purpose of it is to capture the attention of the media and to make a group seem like it's more powerful than it actually is in the process. Just to give a comparison, far more people die a year in the United States from drug overdoses, from heart attacks, from car accidents, and from all sorts of other problems. And of course, internationally, far more people die from conventional wars and civil wars. But the United States, in response to 9/11, had an overreaction. We ended up spending over $1.7 trillion on a problem that was not as extensive as other issues. And on top of that, we used mainly force to deal with it, something that's really going to come back to hurt America in the long run. Now, our case study, just to try to understand the ramifications of the war on terrorism, is this case study, Iraq. So Iraq, in many ways, was severely destabilized. It already had a lot of problems before the war on terrorism, but it's really going to lead to a long-term civil war in this country that it hasn't recovered from still. Now, few things about Iraq, just to understand this country. It's relatively medium-sized country in terms of population, about 38 million people, most of whom are concentrated along the Tigris and Euphrates River Valley. Now, its GDP per capita, the average person only earns a little less than $5,000 per year. And this is in spite of the fact that it has a lot of oil. In fact, it has about 5% of the world's oil resources. It was known as a rentier state. So it's it's not a diversified economy, and as a consequence, this lends the country towards corruption and authoritarianism. Now, it's also ethnically diverse and politically unstable. There are three major ethnic groups. So, in the far northeast here, we have the Kurds, located in the Zagros mountain ranges. So, they speak the Kurdish language, and they're a minority within this country. In the center of the country, we have the Sunni Arabs. Okay. And so here, particularly centered around Baghdad and the regions to the north, we have Sunni Arabs. Now, we talked about Sunni Islam and what it is in a prior lecture. I highly recommend going and watching that. And in the far south, we have the Shia Muslims, okay, centered around the city of Basra here. And so there are three major regions, thus. So we have the Shia Muslims around Basra, the Sunni Muslims around Baghdad, and finally the Kurds centered around the city of Mosul here. So during the days when Iraq was ruled as the Ottoman Empire, it wasn't treated as a single province. It was actually treated as three separate provinces: Mosul, Baghdad, and Iraq, because of those reasons, right? So each of these regions has its own unique histories, its own unique geographies, as well as its different ethnic groups. Now, Saddam Hussein. Okay, so in order to understand the war in Iraq, we have to understand this particular dictatorship and the motives for the US invading this country during the war on terrorism. Well, the country itself was not created until after World War I, and it was created by the British on a map. The British and French divided up the Middle East amongst themselves after World War I, after they defeated the Ottoman Empire. And they ended up creating, the British, this new country, combining Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra into this single country, with Baghdad as the new capital. And of course, the British would also control the foreign policy of Iraq all the way up until 1958. Now, in order to rule over Iraq, they propped up a new monarchy, the Hashemite monarchy, led by King Faisal. This was a monarchy whose descendants came from the city of Mecca. Okay. And so the reason why the British did this was because this family actually helped the British defeat the Ottoman Empire in World War I. So they prop up this monarchy there, and it was a Sunni monarchy. And consequently, the Sunnis became the backbone of this regime. The Hashemite monarchy placed Sunnis within the military, the bureaucracy, at the expense of the Shia and the Kurds. And this led to extensive ethnic conflict from the very beginning of this country. And this is something the country really has never recovered from. Now, in 1927, another important aspect of this regime is that oil would be discovered, and this would become the basis of this country's economy. It's a very dry country outside the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley. There isn't much oil. There isn't much agriculture. So as a consequence, oil is going to become really the backbone of the economy here. Now, in 1932, the country did get quote unquote independence, but the British would continue behind the scenes to manipulate the country's politics. They wanted their oil companies to continue to operate within Iraq, and they also, as well, wanted to prop up this monarchy, which was pro-Western. And thus, during this era, there wasn't much money invested in education, industrial developments. It was really an oil dominant economy. All right, so what happened to change this that's going to lead to Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath Party coming to power? Well, during the course of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, a lot of opposition emerged to this Western-backed regime. Some of this opposition consisted of Arab nationalists, socialists that wanted to unite the Arab world, that wanted closer relations with the Soviet Union. They wanted to redistribute wealth to the poor and industrialize, right? So you had a lot of people who wanted to modernize the country. There were also liberals who wanted to push the country towards democratization. And finally, there were Islamists that wanted to push for Sharia law and conservative religious values. So there was a lot of instability in Iraq during this time period. Lots of attempted assassinations of the king, lots of attempted coups, lots of protest movements. And eventually, the monarch is going to get overthrown in 1958. And in fact, over the next decade, there's going to be a series of 4 different military coups, okay, that's going to culminate, okay, in 1968, when the Arab nationalists, okay, are going to come to power. The Arab nationalists in Iraq were led by the Ba'ath Party. So there was also a Ba'ath Party in Syria that eventually came to power there as well by 1963. So Baathism, Arab nationalism, very popular during this era in Middle East history. Egypt as well had a military coup in 1952, and Gamal Abdel Nasser there is going to promote Arab nationalism. So this party, along with promoting left-wing economics, socialism, redistributing wealth to the poor, they also as well promoted the Arabic language, right, within the school system. And they also sought as well to kick out Western oil companies. And eventually this happened. The Western oil companies were kicked out. Iraqi oil was nationalized. And during the 1970s, when the price of oil was high, the Iraqi state, okay, was really built up. New schools were built, universal education was promoted, universal health care during the 1970s came about. Also, factories were built, public factories. So we begin to see this modern state get constructed, okay, in the process. And while oil prices were high, this new regime was relatively popular. Now, this brings us to Saddam Hussein. Who is this guy? Well, he's going to eventually centralize power in 1979. Okay, so we should learn a little bit about this human being. He was born in the 1930s in Iraq to this small town of Tikrit, north of Baghdad. It was a Sunni Muslim town. He was born to a relatively poor family, but he himself would eventually go on to university and get an education. Now, a couple of things about his personality. Saddam was a bit of a sociopath, and he had a bit of a tragic background. His father died right before he was born. His mother became really depressed, actually tried to abort the pregnancy. Eventually, she failed to do so, actually. And when he was born, she was so depressed about the loss of his father that she decided to abandon the child. And Saddam had a very rough childhood. He was adopted by a family member. His stepfather severely abused him, beat him regularly. So he had a lot of problems. Now, he was relatively smart. He would go into college. He would start with a law degree, although he would eventually drop out to get into politics. And so he was a very angry young man. And he also lived through as well the British occupation of Iraq. There was a lot of mass anger towards the West. And so he decided to join the Ba'ath Party. And in fact, an uncle of him also joined the Ba'ath Party as well. And so he eventually is going to join this party and he's going to engage in a lot of underground activity. He's going to get involved in insurgency activity. He's going to be involved in several attempted assassinations of his political opponents. At one point, he was sent into exile. He was forced first to go to Syria and then Egypt, where he met up with many other Arab nationalist activists. So he became part of this kind of greater Arab nationalist movement. He also spent some time in prison in Iraq, where he was tortured during the middle of the 1960s. So this guy went through it. And as a consequence, he developed a very violent attitude towards his opponents. Well, eventually in 1968, his faction, the Ba'ath Party, they're going to come into power. And he is going to eventually become vice president throughout the course of the 1960s. So he's going to become very popular within the Ba'ath Party because of his, well-known kind of resistance activity during the 50s and 60s. And so thus he's going to become vice president. He was actually responsible for the nationalization of Iraqi oil and for building up the Iraqi state during this time period. But he also began to centralize power and he became very power hungry. By 1979, he's going to become president and he's going to start to sideline his political enemies. He's going to start to throw a lot of people in prison. And there was a very famous moment in 1979, right after he became president, he held this Ba'ath Party meeting with his fellow members of the party. And while the meeting was being held, the head of the party starts to give a speech. And Saddam is looking on, he's got a cigar in his mouth and he's smiling. And one by one, the head of the party begins to read out names. These are the names of people Saddam claimed were traitors to the party. These were his political opponents within the party. One by one, he reads out these names and they get let out. Some of these individuals were thrown in prison, but others were taken out back and shot. And this guy was smiling. See, Saddam was one of these guys that not only, he was power hungry. He enjoyed the political oppression. He enjoyed the authoritarianism. Not all dictators enjoy these aspects of the dictatorship of having to use violence. Saddam seemed to enjoy it. And so 1979, he centralizes power. And he is going to create a very personalistic regime that was incredibly corrupt and that relied on severe repression. And he also used the country's oil revenue to build up the security apparatus. He's going to create one of the world's largest militaries in the process. I highly recommend reading this book by Lisa Blades called State of Repression. She's a Western academic that traveled to Iraq after the 2003 invasion. She actually went to the archives of Saddam Hussein's regime after he was overthrown and wrote this really good book on the nature of Saddam's regime. So here's Saddam Hussein to the right. Well, he was never a member of the military. You could see him wearing the military fatigues. He was highly involved in a lot of militant activity throughout the course of his life. And so after 1979, he comes into power and Iraq becomes a much more violent, aggressive place after this. He developed this reputation and became known as the Butcher of Baghdad. So, for one, he begins to use a lot more violence to deal with the minority groups, the Kurds and the Shia Arabs. And so, as well as Islamists in the country, severe violence was used to suppress these people. No tolerance was given for opponents of the regime. Now, on top of that, he begins to, as well, limits the base of support for the regime. Along with using more violence to control the population, he begins to use less redistribution of wealth and begins to rely more on a smaller and smaller inner circle. Specifically, Sunni Arabs from his tribe in Tikrit become the basis of his support here. So we begin to see the kind of re-tribalization of Iraqi politics here. Now, on top of that, he begins to grow more aggressive internationally. He tries to use a war with Iran not only to unite his population around the regime, but to gain access to more territory and to gain access to Iran's oil resources. We actually talked about this war in a prior lecture on Iran. Now, for Saddam, at the time, he had these kind of grand ambitions of spreading Iraq's territory. And he was hoping to use the revolution in neighboring Iran to invade the country, right? It was a moment of weakness for the Iranian regime, and he thought he could easily take territory from the Iranians. So Iraq invades Iran in 1980. Now, it didn't go as planned for Saddam Hussein because the Iranians were very enthusiastic about this war, right? They mobilized to support their Ayatollah, their Islamic Republic. And in the aftermath of this war, after 8 years, over 1 million people died. Now, in the process, because Saddam did not, for example, he did not trust the Shia in the South, okay? He thought that the Shia were secretly supporting the Shia regime of Iran. He begins to engage in severe ethnic cleansing. If there was any suspected, for example, insurgents in a village, he would sometimes have his troops go into that village and raze it to the ground and destroy it. He also, as well, began to use more violence against the Kurds in the north. Many villages were completely destroyed. Weapons of mass destruction, such as chemical weapons, were used. So there was really a lot of brutality here. And during the course of the war, because of the instability and a lot of the bombings within Iraq itself, there was a lot less access to information. And so thus destroying entire villages to deal with a few insurgents was an easy way to deal with the opposition, but it also led to a lot of mass brutality in the process. In the process, because of this long and brutal war, Saddam's government nearly goes bankrupt. Okay, what was once a rich oil wealth state in the 1970s, the oil resources begin to decline. And this is also part of the reason why Saddam began to use more coercion. Since he has less money to distribute to his own population to keep them happy, he had to use more violence to deal with the opposition. And so by the end of the war, he is bankrupt. By 1988, things are looking bad for Saddam. And he decides, well, I need access to more oil wealth here to deal with the problem. And on top of that as well, a lot of the money he owed that he was borrowing was coming from the Arab Gulf countries, particularly Kuwait. the country right to his south. Okay, Kuwait is a tiny country on the Arab Gulf that has a ton of oil wealth. And so Saddam in 1990 decides to invade Kuwait, okay, in order to A, avoid repaying the Kuwaiti government, and B, to get access to their oil revenue. So he invades Kuwait here, and he thought that the United States, okay, wouldn't have the willingness to go and invade Kuwait. He thought that after what happened with Vietnam back in the 70s, that the American public didn't really have the stomach for another big war with a foreign country. But he was wrong. He miscalculated. So the United States decides to invade Iraq, and they kick Saddam Hussein out. And the United States was very angry with Saddam Hussein at this point, right? Because they had invaded an ally of theirs and an important one. And in fact, there were many individuals within the US government that wanted the United States to go beyond invading Kuwait. They wanted the United States to invade all of Iraq. But the George Bush administration, the first George Bush, decided against it. He thought it would create too much instability in the region. It would be too extensive and too costly. So they just make the decision to invade Kuwait. And they had the support of the United Nations, by the way, and the Arab Gulf states, such as Saudi Arabia. In fact, it's Saudi Arabia that came to the United States asking for help to kick Saddam out of Kuwait here. Keep in mind, the Arab Gulf countries have about half of the world's oil resources. So the U.S. considers this a very strategic area. Now, in the aftermath of this war, the U.S. didn't invade Iraq, but they did put heavy sanctions on Iraq. From 1990 to 2003, the United States crippled Iraq's economy. Okay, and while this didn't affect Saddam Hussein and his inner circle economically, it affected his people. Saddam had to cut welfare spending. It's mostly the poor that suffered the worst here during these sanctions. And on top of this, a no-fly zone was created over Kurdistan in the far north. This allowed the Kurds to gain autonomy under the rule of the Kurdish Democratic Party, the KDP. And so thus, the Kurds were able to gain some autonomy from Saddam. But unfortunately for the Shia in the south, U.S. efforts to try to help the Shia did not succeed here. And Saddam is going to use some severe oppression in the south to deal with the Shia rebellions that were taking place during this era. So here is a map of this, by the way. So Saddam, his base of power was just north of Baghdad in Tikrit here. We have here Kurdistan, where Saddam Hussein engaged in a lot of ethnic cleansing. So the United States put a no-fly zone over here. Now, in contrast, in the south, Saddam would engage in a lot of ethnic cleansing in Basra here in order to try to root out Shia Islamists in this part of the country. Right, so why did the United States change their mind and invade Iraq in 2003? Well, the answer has to do with the war on terror. Okay. In 2000, George W. Bush was elected president. And a few months later, the 9/11 happens. Now, George W. Bush ended up hiring a lot of the same people that his father did for his administration. Okay, people like Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, list goes on and on. A lot of people with close ties to George Bush. His son is going to put them in the administration. Paul Wolfowitz, the list goes on and on. And a lot of these people had wanted to invade Iraq. And so thus, 9/11 presented an opportunity to go and fulfill this kind of dream of overthrowing Saddam's regime. So that was part of the motivation here. Now, on top of that, after 9/11, you had a lot of neoconservatives, this is the Bush administration, who really favored force over diplomacy. And in dealing with Saddam Hussein, they kind of decided, sanctions are not enough. We have to invade this country and overthrow this dictator, right? And replace him with a new regime. Now, there are other motivations for this as well. Okay. With 9/11, it created an opportunity to remove Saddam because there was a lot of Islamophobia that spread throughout the United States. Now, keep in mind, and I grew up during 9/11, there was a lot of mass ignorance about the Middle East. within the United States. People knew very little about this country. They didn't know the differences between Islamists and secularists, between the secular Ba'ath Party or the, Salafist group Al Qaeda or the Taliban. There was little knowledge about the differences between the countries in this region or the nature of these peoples or the complexities of these political systems. All most people knew in the Middle East was A, Saddam bad, B, Muslims responsible for 9/11. So there was a lot of these misconceptions about the region. And on top of that as well, there was a lot of mass anger in the United States. People were looking for a scapegoat, somebody to take down. The Bush administration decided invading Afghanistan wasn't enough. And so thus, Iraq, we have this Muslim majority country, they become another target. But here's the thing, Iraq and Saddam Hussein's regime, Saddam himself was a secularist. He was a Ba'athist. He was a left winger. So, there was a lot of misinformation in the United States. And in fact, the Bush administration also made several false claims about Saddam's regime. Now, to the extent that, were these false claims lies or just based on ignorance or based on wishful thinking, there's lots of debates about this. But regardless of this, several false claims were made. One claim was made that Saddam Hussein was still developing a nuclear weapons program. Now, it's true he had a program in the 1980s, and there were sanctions placed on his regime because of it. But by the 1990s, he had actually dismantled it. Now, to be fair to the Bush administration, Saddam was very coy about this program. He did actually at one point kick out UN weapons inspectors, although eventually they were allowed back in. There was a lot of misinformation here. And so the U.S. government thought that Saddam was developing these weapons. The problem is that weapons inspectors were sent in 2003 to see if Saddam still had nuclear weapons. And their report showed that he did not have the weapons, but the United States decided to ignore that report. And they promoted this idea that, hey, Saddam is this ruthless dictator that has nuclear weapons. Now, part of the problem here as well with this narrative is that at the beginning of the Iran-Iraq War, the United States was actually giving funding to Saddam Hussein's regime to fight the Iranians because the U.S. was against the Islamic Republic. So there was a lot of hypocrisy here and a lot of problems with these justifications for the war. Now, on top of this, they made this claim, and I think this is the even more absurd claim here, but that Saddam Hussein was supporting jihadi Salafist organizations. The reality is Saddam Hussein was a Ba'athist, and he was severely repressing moderate Islamists as well as radical Islamists within his country. So this was just a false narrative that got spread throughout the United States during this time period. And of course, the United States was making these other arguments that if they invaded Iraq, they would be able to spread democracy and prosperity. Now, behind the scenes as well, there are some arguments that have been made that the U.S. was also interested in opening up Iraq's economy to capitalism and to allow Western oil companies into the country. So lots of different motivations here. So at the end of the day, what happens? Well, the United States invades Iraq in 2003. A coalition of 46 countries. Now, most of our main allies did not support this war. The Canadians, the French, the Germans did not support this war. The Russians, French, and Chinese vetoed the resolution in 2003 to invade Iraq. So it didn't get UN approval here. Okay, no UN Security Council approval, unlike Afghanistan. But the United States, they have this small coalition. They invade Iraq. Only the British, our only major allies, supported us there. And because of the flimsy reasons for this invasion, the risks of this invasion, the fact that the U.S. already had troops in Afghanistan, there was already growing opposition to the war on terrorism in the U.S., there was global mass protests against this invasion because it didn't have Security Council approval, because the UN was saying Saddam didn't have nuclear weapons. So this is not to say Saddam did not have a brutal regime. It was a brutal regime. But the arguments for the invasion were very flimsy at this point in 2003. And so, in fact, at this point in history, it was the largest mass protest across the globe in world history. And I'll never forget these protests. It was all over the news. It's what really got me into Middle East politics. Between 9/11 and the Iraq War and the failed response to it, I really myself became politicized by this. This is one of the reasons why I went to study Middle East history and later Middle East politics. So Many, of course, accused Bush of only being interested in opening up this country for oil. For others, Donald Rumsfeld, some argue that he was only interested in testing out new weapons on Iraq. He kind of went with this strategy of using a lot of modern military tech with a really relatively light military force in terms of the number of troops to take over this country. And so what happens in the aftermath of this? Well, Saddam Hussein gets overthrown. He's tried. He's executed here. And in the process, the United States makes the decision. It was a quick invasion. It took only a couple of weeks to overthrow Saddam. And the Ba'ath Party is going to be completely destroyed. So anyone, and I mean anybody, that served in the Ba'ath Party, teachers, doctors, people who worked in the bureaucracy, politicians, members of the military, completely dismantled the entire government apparatus. So they just completely destroyed the government from the top down. So this is even different from what the United States did with Germany after World War II. So the United States did try the top officials of the Nazi regime, but most of the bureaucracy, they were allowed to continue to engage in their functions. Here, though, the United States and Iraq dismantled the Ba'ath, and Ba'ath members were banned from politics, from participating in elections, from having political parties. Now, on top of that, there was a complete economic restructuring. And this is also one of the reasons why a lot of skeptics accuse the Bush administration of being mainly interested in oil here. There was a shift from socialism to capitalism. In fact, this seemed like almost the first concern of the U.S. administration. When they went in, the United States dismantled the public bureaucracies. And on top of that, they began to privatize government services, as well as public-owned oil companies and other public companies. And in the process, Western oil companies and contractors began to flood into Iraq, as did arms contractors, as did a lot of these groups for security, to protect private security outfits, to protect a lot of these Western companies in the country. And in the process, there were mass firings. The public industries are dismantled. Structural adjustment programs, that is the cutting of public spending, get engaged in. And so we have this shift towards capitalism. Now, to justify all this, there was also a democratic transition. So there was a 2-year occupation. Officially, the government was ruled at first directly by the United States, but eventually power is going to be transferred with the new constitution in 2005, where there's going to be elections. Now, on top of this, they are going to create a semi-presidential system of government. It was a republic like that which existed under Saddam. But the big difference, they're going to allow multiple parties to compete. Okay, so unlike Saddam's regime, which is a single party state, here they're going to allow parties to engage in politics. Now, because the Sunni were banned, we can't really, because the Ba'ath were banned, right? Their whole political elite gets dismantled. And because the Kurds, mainly were having their own autonomy in the north, we can't really call this a full democratic transition. The Shia and Kurds, the minorities, are going to dominate the political system. And the Dawa party, the Shia party in the south, and the Kurdish Democratic Party in the north are going to dominate elections. The Shia Nouri al-Maliki is going to become the new prime minister. And, so as a consequence, there is a partial democratic transition here. The elections are going to be more competitive. Now, because of the initial early success of overthrowing Saddam, his statues were torn down and so on and so forth. Bush immediately gets on this aircraft carrier and he goes, mission accomplished, right? Everything's great. Saddam's gone. Okay, we have liberated a new country. And, he falsely claims as well another terrorist haven is destroyed. So, of course, what was the problem with this discourse? Well, all of what the Bush administration did in Iraq is going to create the sort of grounds for an insurgency, a civil war. Those Baathists that got fired, those soldiers that lost their jobs, those bureaucrats that lost their jobs, they're going to almost immediately revolt. They're going to form a coalition called the Islamic Army in Iraq. And, they did try to get other members of the non-Sunni community to try to join their movement by framing it as a larger Islamic insurgency, right? And so but it was supported mainly by former Ba'ath Party members who were angry about the U.S. occupation. And since they were well armed, right, many members of the military, they have weapons, right? They are going to revolt. Okay, so weapons were supplied by former members of the Iraqi military, and they had leadership. Former officers who were able to coordinate this insurgency. And on top of that, there were a lot of people that were angry about the Western occupation of the country. So guerrilla warfare, as well as, ironically, terrorism, has a big uptick, targeted not only at U.S. soldiers, okay, but at civilians, Shia and Kurdish civilians. So there's going to be acts of terrorism committed against these groups. And in Baghdad, where you have a mixed Sunni Shia population, there's going to be attempts to drive Shia out of a lot of neighborhoods there. And in Mosul, where you have a mixed Sunni Kurdish population, there's going to be some violence there as well. Now, in response to this violence, as well as the U.S. occupation, you're going to see the Shia have a counterinsurgency. Now, some of the Shia, some of the more moderate ones, did support the U.S. occupation. Nouri al-Maliki and the Dawa Party are going to support the U.S. So they're more of a moderate Islamist party. They're kind of a Muslim democratic party. In contrast, some of the more extremist groups are going to oppose them. And one of these extremists was Muqtada al-Sadr and his Mahdi army. Now, Muqtada al-Sadr's father had experienced a lot of oppression under Saddam Hussein. And so they had attempted to rebel under Saddam Hussein's regime, and they faced a lot of political oppression. Well, the Mahdi army, with some arms coming from Iran, they begin their own counterinsurgency. Not only did they target Sunnis, they targeted the Islamic Army in Iraq, they had targeted Sunni civilians in Sunni neighborhoods in places like Baghdad. And on top of it, they target American targets. So we get this complex civil war breakout. And once again, terrorist acts were committed. And there was ethnic cleansing in the process of Sunni and Shia neighborhoods. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed. Millions of people were sent as refugees across the border to Syria, to Jordan, to Iran, and elsewhere. So this was just really a mass tragedy. Now, on top of that, it attracted, because of the instability, Salafist jihadist organizations, some of the most radical groups to Iraq. In fact, Al-Qaeda, they're going to form something called Ansar al-Sunnah. Furthermore, a branch of Al-Qaeda, one day, we're going to talk about this, is going to become the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. So Salafi Muslims from Syria, Saudi Arabia, and all across the different parts of the Islamic world. So these small groups of radicals are going to come there and fight. And on top of that, because of the instability, Iran is going to use the instability to increase its influence in Iraq. Now, going back to the days of the Iran-Iraq War, Iran was already trying to foment rebellion in Iraq. They created an organization called the Supreme Council for the Revolution in Iraq to promote this in 1982. And during the war, they supported a military wing during the Civil War called the Badr Organization. And so they also, as well, their branch of Hezbollah is also one day as well going to come into Iraq. So just absolute chaos here. In fact, the Iranians traveled to fight Sunni extremists as well. So you see many Iranians come into southern Iraq. Many Iranians are going to start to travel to Iraq during this era, not only to fight, but some for pilgrimage, some to engage in business. So southern Iraq is going to develop close political ties with the Iranian state here. And they're going to start to as well fight U.S. forces. So here, this insurgency was really bad. And really, the starting point of the insurgency was a terrorist attack. It was this group of Sunni insurgents attacked a very famous mosque in the Iraqi town of Samarra, a very famous Shia shrine, one of the famous 12 imams known in 12er Shi'ism. Okay, that mosque of his dedicated to him was attacked here. And so this really ignited this very terrible civil war here. And on top of that, the United States engaged in serious human rights abuses. Heavy-handed tactics were used to fight insurgents, and many civilians were killed in the process. The U.S., because they didn't put enough troops in often relied on a lot of bombings, for example. There were a lot as well of a lot of sloppiness. Lots of innocent people got caught up in all of it. Many innocent people were put in prison and wrongly tortured. It just led to a lot of problems. And on top of that, a prison in Baghdad was turned into this place where torture was used on individuals. And suspects were often imprisoned for long periods of time without trial. Many were shipped all the way to Guantanamo Bay for this purpose. And as a consequence of all of these failures and problems, American opinion is going to turn against this war. In fact, at the beginning of the war, the Bush administration promised it would only last a few weeks. It ended up lasting many years. And so by 2007, Bush is going to there's going to be a lot of problems with the Republican Party. They're going to lose the midterm elections, and Bush is going to shift strategy. He's going to dump his Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, and replace him. And in the process, they're going to move towards a more practical way of dealing with this problem. Instead of using nothing but force to deal with these insurgents and these quote unquote terrorists, he's going to use money to buy off these insurgents. They're going to start to inject more money into the Iraqi economy. They're going to start to give a lot of these Sunni insurgents money to convince them to come to the negotiation table, to incentivize them to talk so they moderate their behavior. And they're also going to have a troop surge. They're going to put more troops on the ground to provide more security for people. And so, as a result of these strategies, the civil war is going to end, but not before hundreds of thousands of lives were lost, not before the country was destroyed, in many ways irreparably. So, it's still a very unstable country here. Now, the U.S. forces are going to leave in 2011, but they're eventually going to have to come back in 2014 because a little group known as ISIS is going to emerge. We'll talk about that later. So these images of torture here, they spread over social media, and it really hurt the reputation of the United States. Now, one final note here, the failures of the war on terrorism. $2 trillion have been spent on this war. And terrorism has only increased since 2001. We talked about how it increased in Iraq, and it increased elsewhere. It increased in Afghanistan. It increased in a lot of those countries we've bombed. Countries like Yemen, for example. We've been bombing Yemen for over 2 decades. So it's, people have been talking about this recently with the Trump administration, but we've been bombing this country for a long time. And approximately 1 million were killed and millions of refugees were created in the process. And in fact, Iraq and Afghanistan still suffer from chronic violence. And I want to hear something that's even more tragic. 2 decades of U.S. occupation. They initially took out the Taliban. They tried to install a democracy there. But eventually, after 2 decades of failed policies, the U.S. leaves by 2021 and the Taliban come right back into power. In domestic and international attitudes towards the United States declined during this era. It would only as well decline after the 2008 financial crisis. The U.S. was severely hurt as a world power because of this. The U.S. also grew severely in debt during this era as a global power. So it was the war on terrorism, just an absolute disaster for the United States, with very few upsides to this. And I think we learned a lot of lessons, from this. Well, I hope we would, right? So certainly a lot of academics have written about the lessons we should learn about this. You can't just deal with terrorism with bombs, okay? Islamists, by the way, are not destined to be radical. There are plenty of moderate Islamists that participate in democracies. Furthermore, not all terrorists are Islamists. You can be a radical left-winger as well and commit terrorism. With stable government, democracy, economic development, with better relations between ethnic and religious groups, you can have better relations between the left and right. You could have more peaceful politics and less radicalization, right? But that requires a different approach to politics. You cannot just use force to deal with the problem. You also have to use other methods, okay? And by the way, really quickly, of course, the problems in Iraq are not just because of the United States, okay? Some of the problems there even date back to the days of the Ottoman Empire or the days of the British or the regime of Saddam Hussein and the brutal repression there, as well as the behavior of Iran and other neighboring states towards Iraq. So I don't oversimplify this problem, but the U.S. played a very big role in creating some of the current challenges within the Iraqi state. So how we've dealt with terrorism has not worked well. Okay. Well, that does it for this lecture. I hope you got something from it. Leave some questions down below if you have them. Have a great